Webinars are a great resource to use for sharing your knowledge and establishing your authority on your subject. It seems as if they are everywhere in the online course world, with everyone from Melyssa Griffen to Mike Futia using them as part of their online course process. But what is a webinar, and how can you integrate one into your online course offering? Today, I have the absolute privilege of having Melyssa Guller on the podcast to answer just that question. Melyssa is a course creation expert and the CEO of Wit and Wire, where she helps creators turn their skills and passions into profitable online businesses. She's produced multiple top 50 podcasts, hosted over 100 podcast episodes, and her podcast Everything is Teachable topped the charts as the #2 career podcast in America. She's a top-rated instructor at General Assembly NYC and on Skillshare, and she previously worked full-time for Ramit Sethi and Teachable. Welcome to Bloggers Creating Courses, the podcast which will take you behind the scenes of creating an online course. I'm your host, Verity Songon, founder and education consultant of veritysongon.com. I'm so excited to help you create an online course that you are proud of and to be part of your journey to scale your business as an online course creator. Let's get into the episode. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited. I am going to fangirl a little bit and say that I have stalked you on your Wit and Wire podcast for quite some time now. And if any of our listeners are thinking of starting a podcast, I'm going to give Melyssa a little bit of a shout out now and say, do listen to her Wit and Wire podcast because it is absolutely fantastic. And I used it as a bit of a crash course for this podcast. I'm going to hand over to you now, Melyssa. Please tell us all about you. Who are you? Tell us all the things about you and what you do.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be fangirled over. I feel like I'm just a normal girl in my studio apartment here in Brooklyn, but I'm always honored to connect with people and be helpful. So I run a business called Wit and Wire, and I help creators turn their own skills and passions into profitable online businesses. I felt really fortunate to previously work full-time for Ramit Sethi and Teachable, and working for those businesses really opened my eyes to the kind of business you could run online. This is well before the pandemic, well before people knew what an online business really meant. And just seeing people talk about flying drones, watercolor painting, raising goats, and being able to do what they loved and share it online, I felt like that was really important to empower more people to do and to talk about it. So that's the mission of my company today. And I feel very fortunate to run my own business full-time doing work I love.
Absolutely fantastic. And we've got a really interesting topic that we are talking about today because we're going to be talking about webinars. And I wanted to talk to you about this because you're starting a webinar in a day course quite soon, or have you started that yet?
I've run one intensive so far and planning to run more in the future, which I'm very excited about.
That's really exciting. So it's really timely to get you on and talk about this subject, because I feel that quite often, especially at the moment, webinars are being blasted at us left, right and centre. We see them advertised on Facebook, on Twitter, whichever social media platform we're on. They seem to be kind of the thing of the moment, quote unquote, and for want of a better term there. So I'm going to dive straight in and ask you quite a big question as the first question, but what is a webinar and how does a webinar differ from an online course?
Very important. So a webinar, the way that we're going to use it is an opportunity for you to do a virtual training where you get to share more information about your expertise and present an offer at the end. They are usually offered for free. And to be very clear, it's not a giant infomercial. You still want to share a lot of value, and you're usually giving prospects informed decision-making power. You're teaching about your area of expertise, why you're the right person, how your method works. And then at the end, you're sharing a very clear call to action to join a program, a service, or submit an application. And that's very different from an online course or even a workshop, where although you may see the term like training or workshop used for webinars, I think of a workshop as something virtual that is very action-oriented, very step-by-step. There are clear objectives. People walk away in the end and they have learned something, as opposed to the webinar where your goal is to empower people to make a decision at the end. So that's a bit of a compare-contrast.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think that's so wrapped up really nicely in a nutshell, is that there is that offer at the end, which will hopefully lead into your online course and could serve very naturally and nicely as that lead in. It links back to a sales funnel, I suppose, in a way, doesn't it? And a lot of people could use a webinar as a great introduction to, like you said, setting themselves up for their online course and setting up their own expertise there. When, I know I mentioned web funnels there, but when might you want to create a webinar versus an online course?
I think an online course, because it's a paid product, should always come first. The way that I see business, I like to choose your signature offer, whether it starts off as a one on one service or a course. I don't believe you have to do one or the other first. But I think in order to create a solid foundation for a business, thinking of that signature offer, that thing that people will pay you for, where you can help them achieve some kind of goal or address a challenge that they're already thinking about, that's where I always start. I imagine a funnel almost upside down, like a triangle, where the bottom is that offer itself. And to me, before you get into a webinar, what I would recommend and what I work on with clients and students is getting that offer in place, even with a couple of buyers, because that validates demand for the offer itself before you then kind of move one level up in the funnel, which is where the webinar fits in. The webinar is your opportunity to sell your paid service, course, whatever it is that people are going to buy from you. And unless you've done that groundwork to make sure that the offer itself is profitable, you're going to have a hard time figuring out if the webinar didn't convert or if your offer won't sell. So that's why I like to work backwards. But then once you have that course that's even sold a little bit, having a webinar is a great strategy to promote your offer. And then the way that your overall marketing funnel might look is that you have your social strategies, maybe you do partnerships, you have traffic coming in from anywhere. And if you're driving all that traffic into a webinar, that's going to be almost a replacement for a salesperson. We don't have unlimited time and money to hire an actual salesperson to talk about your course. But without it, people may not have enough info to make a buying decision. So it's kind of that middle ground between cold traffic, giving them the info they need, and then converting people into buyers.
Absolutely. And I really want to pick up on something you said there about working backwards, because that was something that by the time this episode comes out, it'll be a couple of weeks ago for the episodes that we talked about with Kira Holly, actually working backwards when you come to anything with your online course, be it working out your price point or whatever. And I love what you said there about validating your idea, because I think so often we see information online which tells us we have to think about the entire selling process. And yes, we do need to think about the entire selling process. But as you said, if the funnel isn't working, if you throw everything into it, you're not going to know which part of the funnel isn't working. And as you said, you need to validate that idea right from the get-go there and right from the beginning. So important. For our listeners who might be thinking, yes, I want to set up a webinar as part of my sales funnel, how would you recommend they go about choosing a topic for their webinar? Because I think sometimes people get a little bit concerned, particularly that they're giving away this piece of information for free. And one thing I always say to people is actually give away your most value for free, because then people will come to you for more. But a lot of people get quite worried by that advice, because they're like, well, if I give away what's most valuable, no one's going to buy anything from me. So what is your advice to our listeners if they want to set up a webinar? How would you recommend that they go about choosing a topic for their webinar that doesn't detract from their main offer but still gives value to their audience?
What I would do is think first about your offer. So let's imagine your course at the end. There are probably initial questions that are already on people's minds at the beginning. So if they are trying to figure out how to lose weight, what are the kinds of questions that they might be Googling? What are the things that they're asking? And you want your webinar to address one of those very obvious questions. Usually it is a how-to statement, how to do this. And often a popular strategy is to also use the word without. How to lose weight without counting calories, how to start a podcast without a huge starting audience. If you have that without clause, you're not only addressing the main thing they're looking for, but you're also kind of enticing them that they don't have to do the thing that they think they need to do. And then within the webinar itself, I would say where people go wrong is that they treat it like a workshop. They offer a clear step-by-step. They're giving you the overview. They're teaching you exactly how to do the thing they came for. But the problem is that you are closing the loop. You're giving people the answer to their question, and you aren't opening the door for them to have more questions. And with the webinar, you want to do something even before you have a how-to. So if I were to break down kind of two major pieces, yes, in the second half, you want to talk about the process. How do you lose weight? How do you start a podcast? You want to address that for sure. But before that, there's probably a reason these people haven't already done it. Like, why haven't they already reached the goal? And a big reason why is because there are mental blocks or fears or challenges or misconceptions that they have about your area of expertise. And because they believe that those are true, they haven't started. So I'll give an example from my podcasting masterclass. A lot of people believe that you need a huge audience in order to make money. And most people believe the best way to earn money podcasting is through sponsorship. So in the first section, before I talk about a method, I have to kind of squash those myths. So I talk a little bit about the reality of earning money through sponsorship, and I give exact numbers to talk about how little you can really earn. And then I share a mindset shift about how I treat my podcast and how I earn money instead. And so those mindset shifts are actually what's most important. So when it comes to choosing the topic, the way that you'll market your podcast, the title of it is going to be maybe something pretty straightforward about how to do the thing that they really want without the thing that they really hate. But the webinar itself has those two clear parts. You first need to talk about and address the misconceptions, and then you get into more of a process before you present your program as the way that they can use that signature process.
Yes, it comes back to that kind of age-old marketing tactic, doesn't it, of leave people wanting more. If you've dispelled those myths, as you said, they're ready and they're set up for that learning journey. It comes back to that idea of scaffolding learning, doesn't it? That you're setting that basis because you're setting up that foundation of this is what you know, or it might be what you don't know, but I'm laying the foundation. I'm going to give you almost the first rung of information, but actually if you want the second and subsequent rungs of information, you're going to have to go through and get the actual course.
I think as well, when you're like, scaffolding is a good visual because it's almost like you have this consistent, like, yes, I've gotten my answer, but also, yes, I have more questions now. Like, once you show people a little bit, you're opening more doors they couldn't have had open before. And I also want to differentiate with a course or a workshop. Your goal is to give people steps so that they can do a job, so that they can reach an outcome. With a webinar, your goal is for them to leave believing that they can reach the outcome. It's a lot more about like mentally clearing their roadblocks and empowering them to make a decision that they want to reach the goal. And then your course is the way that they reach the goal. But hopefully that's a helpful distinction.
Absolutely. I love that distinction so much. And it's made me immediately think in education when I did my education training is we get taught about this thing called Jaharis window, and not wanting to go into it too much depth, but it's about how you get some students that come and they know what they don't know. So they therefore know what they want to learn. But then you also get those students who don't know what they don't know. And that's something that you're really tapping into from what you're saying with the webinar. You've got people coming to you, thinking to themselves, yes, I know that this is what I want to achieve. And this is the without bit that you said. This is how they're going to achieve that. But then you're also going to hopefully pique their interest a little bit in the webinar as well by introducing ideas that they didn't know that they didn't know. And then they're thinking, oh gosh, this is what I'm going to learn through going through this funnel and getting to the online course there. I love that. So next big question, how might you go about creating a webinar? Do you have a strategy or a process that you could offer to listeners who are thinking of creating a webinar?
The thing I would do first is create a framework for the webinar itself. And I have something that I teach in the intensive called the 6-star webinar framework because they all start with S. But to even just simplify it, we've talked kind of high level about the pieces. And what I would do first is identify the offer. So that's the very end of the webinar. And your offer is the way that you position your course or your sales item. It could be a service at a particular moment in time. So at the end of the webinar, you want to give people a reason to buy now. And usually that involves some kind of special promotion. Maybe you add in a bonus one-on-one course with you. Maybe you add in something extra. That is the offer. So usually you start with that. Then you work your way one step backwards. So the slides that come immediately before the offer, I call that your signature method. So that's where you take a look at your program or your service and you break it down into the major milestones or phases that people go through. This is the part that delivers on the promise of how do I do blank? And it's where you kind of give people the walkthrough. So for me, when it comes to podcasting, I might talk about things like how to choose the right topic, how to create binge-worthy episodes, how to publish them and start sharing your podcast, and then how to scale to get your first 1,000 listeners. So I might break it down into those big pieces. And that section is preceded by the other crucial section, which is something I call the shift. That is where you really identify what are those misconceptions, what are those blocks that are preventing people from believing they can reach this outcome that I'm helping them reach at the end of my program. And you want to address them and then flip them using this mindset shift strategy. So, to use the same example from before, with podcasting, people believe the best way to earn money as a podcaster is to build a big audience, find sponsors, and then get paid. But through a series of slides, I find the industry averages for how much you can actually earn from sponsors based on your audience size, which really paints the picture that it's a pretty small number, even if you have a fairly successful podcast in the top 5%. And then what I do instead is I use my podcast as a marketing channel to promote my own products and services. And that's how I'm able to earn much more money as a podcaster by having that mindset shift. And so the purpose of putting that shift section there is so you can, again, open people's minds, help them believe that the outcome is attainable so that when they hear your signature process and then the pitch, they can see themselves joining and feeling excited. Before the shift, there are 3 shorter sections, and those are more about like introducing yourself, kind of setting up the scene. So we won't go through those 3 in depth. But if I were to create a webinar today, I would kind of outline each of those pieces first. Like, what are the 3 shifts? What's the process I'm going to cover? How am I going to position my offer? So I would get all of those in place. And then I would use that information to create my registration page. That's the landing page where you drive traffic, where people have the opportunity to submit their email address in exchange for registering for your webinar. And I will say outright, I believe doing the webinar live the first time is what I typically recommend because you get feedback from that first audience on the flow. You get to kind of practice. And even if what you want long term is an evergreen webinar, which I'll define in a second, I still think doing anything live the first time is a great way to iron out the kinks and figure out what works. So, just to briefly define the word, evergreen webinar means people could watch it on demand at any time. Sometimes that means that they're picking a time when they opt in to say, I want to watch it at 2 p.m. Other times it means they're just submitting an email and they can click play on a video. But yeah, in terms of the first webinar, just to kind of keep us focused right now, I would say outline what goes into the webinar, create your registration page and all of the tech that goes into helping people attend the webinar. And then you would be creating your slides, delivering them live, and following up the webinar with a series of sales emails to continue talking about your offer for a limited time, usually about a week after the event.
That is such good advice. I really hope that somebody sat down with a notebook and pen whilst you were going through that, because that's so much value. There are 2 things that I want to pick up on what you said there. The first one you said was about making sure that you are advertising your own products, because I completely agree with that. And it doesn't matter if you're from looking at this from as a podcaster, as a blogger, whatever it is, selling your own products is going to be so much more valuable in the long run for your business than sponsorships. Because yes, don't get me wrong, there's always the one person who doesn't fit that mold, who does make goodness knows how much money through sponsorships and affiliate marketing, and that's brilliant. But for the majority, selling your own products is really where it's at, and making sure that you're advertising those products. I think that's such valuable information. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on there that you said was about getting feedback, because I think sometimes, particularly if we're new to creating an online course or webinar, we can be a little bit scared sometimes of getting feedback. We're not sure if we want the feedback. But I think what people need to remember is there's no such thing as bad feedback, because every piece of feedback is valuable. You might not agree with it. It might just be one person's opinion, but that's fine. It's all valuable at the end of the day. And I'm a bit of a feedback queen. I can talk about feedback. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. But that's a little bit of an aside there. But yes, I think asking for feedback, I love this idea of doing it live first time. And I think there's probably some people who are thinking, I don't want to go live, that there is nothing that terrifies me more. But the one thing that I would say is, if people are feeling nervous about going live, is what is the worst thing that's going to happen? Especially if your webinar is free. it's not like you're going to be having loads of people ask for refunds or what have you. The absolute worst thing that happens is you turn around and say, look, sorry guys, this just isn't, I'm going to have to reschedule. There is a very big blogger who just a couple of weeks ago, I was signed up to one of her webinars, and she emailed literally 2 minutes, no exaggeration, 2 minutes before the webinar was supposed to begin, and just said, I'm really sorry, I am having a nightmare with my tech. I have to rearrange for next week. And I actually really liked that because it was so brutally honest. And I thought, if somebody as big as yourself can admit to your audience that you're having tech issues, then everybody else can admit that they're having tech issues. So to go back to my point of, I love that that advice of go live the first time. And if you're worried, just think, what is the worst thing that is actually what's the worst thing that's going to happen? We've gone through 2 years of 2.5 years, however long it's been now, of everyone doing everything online. We're used to tech fluff ups and us getting our words in a muddle and all the rest of it.
What's nice too about going live is people don't expect you to be perfect. Like I used to teach in-person classes at General Assembly here in New York. And when I'm at the front of the room talking about all my nerdy Excel stuff, people don't expect you to be perfectly edited. Like if you flub a little bit, you just keep going. But for some reason, when it's online, it almost feels like we're supposed to be perfect, which makes absolutely no sense. And I think now that we're all used to doing things online, being on Zoom, all of this stuff, if you show up to this live webinar and you're sitting at your desk, you've got your normal setup, you are a normal human being, people like that. Like they will connect with you because of who you are, and they don't need you to be so polished. And if you have a little bit of a tech issue, even while you're live, just tell them. Just say, hey, I'm actually having a bit of a tech issue. Give me 1 second. I'm going to be back up and running. And like you said, it is a free event. So it's not as though they're going to be too upset. The worst thing that could happen is that it all kind of pauses and then you either follow up with a new time or you just go from there. But I also think going live and doing these free webinars is a good way to get a little bit of practice because people do not expect you to be perfect. You could do a live weekly webinar for a little bit, the same one, but just kind of testing it out to work on your material and also just to see like what are those FAQs you're getting in the chat. I think that webinars are a great way to do customer research, to learn what it is that people really want from you and how you can deliver on that. So that's the specific feedback that I'm always paying attention to. What have I missed that I could include in this webinar that could be maybe the thing holding somebody back from buying that now I can include in my slides to even make this a higher converting piece of marketing for my business?
Absolutely. And if it can't be included in your webinar, it might be something that you end up picking up to go on your online course later on. And yes, I am a huge fan of feedback. So I'm so glad that you raised that there. So what I would ask you now then is, because we have covered so much talking about webinars, which has been really, really exciting. What would your key takeaway be for listeners from this episode?
I think a question I'm often asked is how do I find attendees for my webinar, especially if I have a small audience? So a key takeaway I want to share is that I would recommend making sure you get at least 100 people to attend your webinar before you decide if it's working or not. Now, it doesn't mean you have to get 100 people once. It could mean that you do this idea of a live series. And there's very friendly tech where you can have one registration page. And then let's say you're doing it every Wednesday. The time on that page just changes to the following week, and you show up and you do the exact same webinar with your tweaks. You have the exact same follow-up emails. So it's not about 4 new webinars, but I think it's really important to use data to drive your decisions instead of your gut feeling. And I think what can often happen is if only 20 people show up the first time and nobody purchases, it can feel really demoralizing. It can make you feel like it was your webinar that was the problem. In fact, it could just be that you just have not enough people yet who have seen your offer. And I can share that for a live webinar, you should typically convert 5 to 10% of your attendees into buyers. But then if you have an evergreen webinar, meaning that it's on demand, people are not watching you live, they're hitting play at any time, those convert between 2 to 5%. Now, at first, it may seem obvious, okay, I should always do live. But what's interesting with an evergreen webinar is that the attendance rate is higher because people can choose their scheduled time. They can watch it at any time. They can watch it just immediately if they want. So it kind of balances out. I don't believe that live or evergreen is better or worse. One scales a little bit better. One gives you closer contact to your people. But yeah, that's my best advice. I believe that webinars are a great fit for any course creator or service provider who has already sold their offer even a few times, and now you're trying to scale up and bring more traffic towards your offer, and you need a tool that can educate them about your process and your solution. So I wouldn't do it if you have never sold one student into your course or one person in to your service offering. But I do think even having 2 to 5 buyers, that's enough to validate demand for the offer itself. And then you could start considering a webinar as your kind of central piece of your marketing. This is the place where you could have opt-ins in your blog posts. You could drive people from your podcast. You can talk about it on social media. You can be a podcast guest on other people's podcasts and drive people to this free webinar. It's very hard to drive cold traffic directly to a paid offer. So yeah, I hope the key takeaway is that you can use a webinar as that middle ground, almost as your substitute salesperson, to help you share more about your process, give people the information they need, get them curious about what your paid offer could involve, and help them make that kind of buying decision.
I think that's a fantastic takeaway. And there's two things that I want to put up, that I want to pick up from what you said there. Is first of all about the conversion rate. I think those numbers that you gave are so important for people to bear in mind, because if we're saying that you're going to have 10 people, let's just say it's your first webinar, you have 10 people attend, thinking about that conversion rate of 5 to 10%, well, actually, you're only going to get potentially statistically one person actually buy in from that 10. Now, for some people, they might find that quite demoralizing and think, well, what's the point? I've only had one person buy in. But actually, if you've got that one person buy in, you've met the statistic. So actually, you're really on the right course and you need to continue forward with that. So I think that's really important. And it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about that mindset shift and remembering that it's not about selling. It is about meeting your own targets as well, but also being realistic with those targets. And there's something else that I wanted to pick up on about what you were saying about potentially running the same live webinar for a series of weeks. That it might be a couple of months that you end up running the same one for, working on feedback and going through that feedback, putting in the work for changing the webinar the next time. And what I love about that is because I think quite often there's a misconception out there that webinars, particularly evergreen webinars, is a passive income and it's a passive process. Is that it is the complete opposite. There is a process that if they start becoming an evergreen model, that's great, but there is an awful lot of work that comes in beforehand before it becomes evergreen and passive income. And again, I think that's really important for listeners to remember. It's not a record a 60-minute webinar or what have you, and then stick it online and that's it. It's going to generate money. As you said, it could be, or it should be, quite a long process to actually make sure that it is right and it fits your sales funnel and it fits your audience and it fits your offer as well. So I think that's a really important part of your takeaway that I really wanted to pick up on there. And as you said, finding people for your webinar, go on podcasts, make sure you're putting it on your blog, loads of different ways. I will just ask a question though, because there might be a couple of listeners out there or a few listeners thinking, well, actually I have already guested on a podcast or two. I talk about my offer on my blog. I'm putting it up on social media. I'm just not getting any traction. Would you have any advice for those listeners?
I think that could be an indicator that people are not ready to go from a cold lead to immediately buying from you. And I think it underlines the main benefit of having a webinar, which is people are willing to take a step for free. There's this psychological effect in marketing we talk about called a series of yeses. And that says that the more times people say yes to you, the more likely they are to continue saying yes to you. So a yes could be liking a post on social media. It could be tuning into hearing you on a podcast. It could be opting into something free on your website. It could be signing up for a webinar. All of these are small yeses. And the more times they say yes to you, the more natural it will feel to say yes in the future. So if you go on a podcast and that's someone's first time hearing you, they may not be ready to say yes yet. And it might not have to do with you. It could just be the timing. They're not ready for it. But if you give them something to opt in that is free, that's a smaller commitment, a much smaller yes than asking for something that's paid. So the webinar in the middle, I think, is helpful for two reasons. One, obviously, is that it's this small yes. They now have the opportunity to hear your pitch. Maybe they join. But another takeaway, because we're talking about the conversion rate, is that yes, it could feel like, wow, 2 to 5% of people converting from an evergreen webinar is not that much. Is it really worth it? However, the rest of those people, the 95 to 97, 98% of people, they're still on your email list now. They are now in your world, and you can market to them in the future. And I have seen from my own business that the long tail conversion of those subscribers is significant, where people may not be ready to buy the day they find out about you, but in 3, 6, or even 12 months, they will be. So that's another reason why webinars are great to build your business, because you can't control when the timing is right for somebody, but you can present yourself as the person who can help solve their problem when they're ready.
I believe people need to statistically see or hear about your offer 7 to 10 times before they are at that point of being ready to say yes to your big offer. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have learned so much, and I hope that our listeners have taken away so many golden nuggets of information as well. What I'm going to ask you now is, what is your contact information? Where can people find you on social media if they want to find out more about you and what you do? Tell us where we can catch up with you.
So I hang out mostly on TikTok and YouTube at Wit and Wire, where I share course creation and online business tips. And since we've been talking all about webinars, the question I'm asked the most is probably, which webinar platform or software do I recommend? So if you want to download my comparison of the top platforms for live or evergreen webinars, you can visit witandwire.com/webinar platforms.
I love that. And we will get all of that linked down in the show notes as well, so people can find that and click on those links. And hopefully, if people are thinking of creating a webinar, they will be able to use that comparison tool there and make an informed decision, because there are so many platforms out there, just like online course platforms. Well, Melyssa, I've had such a good time, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Bloggers Creating Courses. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, leave a rating and a review. Ratings and reviews help us to reach more people who want to build and scale their online course, so you're really helping to widen the support for our blogging community. To catch all of the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at VeritySongon. I'll see you next time. Happy content creating.